So dear students, dear colleagues, dear guests, I would like to welcome you to the first lecture of Decoloniality Now online lecture series on interdisciplinary perspectives on coloniality and decoloniality. So starting today, this series includes 6 lectures until the 12th of February next year. My name is Ercüment Çelik. I'm a sociologist at the University of Freiburg and a member and scientific coordinator of Decoloniality Now initiative. Decoloniality Now is a multidisciplinary collaborative research initiative at the University of Freiburg that seeks to understand the impact of coloniality on today's world and the ways in which people and institutions in all regions of the world, including our own, remember, maintain, and contest the legacy of colonialism with a focus on the present day. That's why we have now at the end of our title. We aim to develop research practices that seek to overcome colonial hierarchies within the system of global knowledge production. We adopt a systematic global perspective that transcends conventional regional categories and includes the reflective examination of coloniality in European societies and institutions. I would like to thank the Global Studies Master's Program at the University of Freiburg and Human Rights, Education and Solidarity Working Group of the Connecticut Baden-Württemberg Human Rights Research Consortium for their cooperation in organizing this lecture series. Today, Professor Manisha Desai will deliver a lecture on intersectional coloniality in 19th century India. Thank you, Manisha, for accepting my invitation and honoring us. Manisha is the Executive Director of Center for Changing Systems of Power and the Empowerment Trust Endowed Professor of Global Citizenship at Stony Brook University in the United States. Her areas of research and teaching include gender and development, transnational feminisms, global justice, and particularly climate justice movements and human rights. As a senior research associate of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, Manisha is part of the Global Network for Research and Action for a New Eco-Social Contract. So she is also on the steering committee of the Federation of Feminist Journal Editors that is seeking to establish a feminist knowledge commons outside commercial publishing to ensure the free circulation of feminist knowledge across borders and language barriers. Now I'd like to invite Manisha to deliver her lecture. Please.
Thank you, crew. Good morning, good afternoon to those of you who are in Germany, but I know I have colleagues from here, so it's still morning for us. And I speak to you all today from the unceded land of the Shinnecock and Setauket peoples. So we cannot talk about decoloniality without talking about settler coloniality and the way in which it continues in the United States. And I think today I cannot also not talk about what just happened, which was a big gut punch to those of us with the election results of last week and what that means for continued imperialism rather than just coloniality. And so I kind of want to begin with this poem that some of us were referring to last week as we were all still, and we are still trying to process the election results. And this is Langston Hughes' poem, and it's called Let America Be America. And the poem goes, let America be America again. Let it be the dream it used to be. Let it be the pioneer on the plain, seeking a home where he himself is free. America never was America to me. Let America be the dream dreamers dreamed. Let it be that great strong land of love where never kings connive nor tyrants scheme, that any man be crushed by one above. It never was America to me. Oh, let my land be a land where liberty is crowned with no false patriotic wreath, but opportunity is real and life is free. Equality is in the air we breathe. There's never been equality for me, nor freedom in this homeland of the free. Say, who are you that mumbles in the dark? And who are you that draws your veil across the stars? I'm the poor white, fooled and pushed apart. I'm the Negro bearing slavery scars. I'm the red man driven from the land. I'm the immigrant clutching the hope I seek and find only the same old stupid plan of dog eat dog, of mighty crush the weak. I'm the young man full of strength and hope, tangled in that ancient, endless chain of profit, power, gain, of grab the land or grab the gold, of grab the ways of satisfying need, of work the men, of take the pay, of owning everything for one's own greed. I'm the farmer, bondsman to the soil. I'm the worker, sold to the machine. I'm the Negro, servant to you all. I'm the people, humble, hungry, mean, hungry yet today, despite the dream, beaten yet today, O pioneers. I am the man who never got ahead, the poorest worker battered through the years. Yet I'm the one who dreamed our basic dream in the old world while still a serf of kings, who dreamt a dream so strong, so brave, so true, that even yet its mighty daring sings in every brick and stone, in every furrow turned, that's made America the land it has become. Oh, I'm the man who sailed those early seas in search of what I meant to be my home. For I'm the one who left dark Ireland's shore and Poland's plain and England's grassy lea, and torn from black Africa's strand I came to build a homeland of the free. The free? Who said the free? Not me, surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, the millions who have nothing for our pay, for all the dreams we've dreamed and all the songs we've sung and all the hopes we've held and all the flags we've hung, the millions who have nothing for our pay except the dream that's almost dead today. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never yet has been and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, Indians, Negroes, me who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain. From those who live like leeches on the people's life, we must take back our land again, America. Oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me. And yet I swear this oath, America will be, out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the land, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains and the endless plains, all the stretch of these great green stables, and make America again. To me, this was important because we've all been dealing, as probably you all know, with what was unthinkable to us, but not surprising. And so I think the work continues to let America be America again. And so I offer, my kind of comments in that vein of really searching, hoping, but also hoping to build together collectively with those of us who do share the values and dreams that will enable people to be free of all kinds of peoples and everywhere. And so today what I want to talk about is work I've been doing recently, given the decolonial turn in sociology. Sociology came late to decoloniality, anthropologists in some ways, and it kind of makes sense because anthropologists were studying the other, and so it was very easy to think about the coloniality of anthropology. But with sociology, I think because sociologists were primarily focused on looking at the industrial changes in Europe, it was really in some ways a very insular discipline. Yet in the last 20 years, sociologists like Bambara, like Julian Go, have begun to kind of question the ways in which sociologists always looked internally while thinking that anthropology was the other, but that this kind of internal rethinking had to happen for us to think about what Bambara has called connected sociologies, or what Julian Go talks about as global sociologies. And so my intervention here is to talk about, the ways in which we have been deconstructing or critiquing coloniality in sociology, but we've not been offering some alternatives that already exist. And I think part of that is because of the ways in which we have not looked at thinkers and actors beyond the European context. And so I want to bring today to you the work of Savitribai Phule, who was herself, if you're familiar with the caste system in India, it's a hierarchy, and she was the bottom of the caste hierarchy. So it's interesting that she and her husband, Jyotirao Phule, started this society called the Satyashodak Samaj. So Ikra, if you could go to the next slide, please. And interestingly enough, both of them, even though they belonged to the lowest caste, they were not Dalit. Dalits were kind of outside the caste system and untouchables. So both Jyotirao Phule and Savitribai Phule were at the bottom of the caste hierarchy, but still within the caste, they were not quite untouchables. And in both their cases, what was interesting was coloniality, British colonialism actually helped them to gain the tools that allowed them then to question Indian hierarchy and to kind of rethink coloniality. So they started Satyashodak Samaj, which literally means the truth seeker society. So they kind of value truth. And in some ways, just given where we are today in this country, where we think about alternative facts and, fake news, that truth becomes really central. And for them, truth was very central in the 19th century at all. And their focus was to kind of use truth to liberate society from colonial, but more importantly, also from pre-colonial hierarchies of caste, patriarchy, and class. And so their focus was on intellectual, social, and economic development, which were seen as key to liberation. And to become a member, you had to commit to these changes in your daily life, right? So praxis was very much part. So you couldn't just say, I'm going to be a member, I'll come and, attend your events. No, you had to be committed to, because Indian society in 19th century was very segregated by caste. Caste did not intermingle, so they were socially very segregated. You had to kind of invite people of the other caste, other religions. And so you kind of had to practice. So becoming a member of the society meant you committed to actually what in social movements we call prefigurative politics. That is, you actually live the politics you want to see in the future. And so collective action and solidarities across differences was a key to their social change paradigm. Next slide, please. So what do I mean by intersectional coloniality? So I first want to define that because their decolonial practice was to actually enact a critique of intersectional coloniality. So that was kind of their decolonial practice. But to do that, they actually first defined what I'm calling intersectional coloniality. And so what they did in intersectional coloniality is looking at colonial hierarchies of caste, class, and gender. But a kind of brilliant move that Jyotiba did was to talk about multiple colonizers. So for him, the British were not the only colonizers in India in the 19th century. They talked about the Aryans who had come from what is now Central Asia to India as the first colonizers. In fact, they conceptualized those Aryans as settler colonials, right? Because they came from Central Asia and they settled in India and they pushed the native Dravidians to the south. And so today you can kind of still see differences between Northern Indians and Southern Indians, even in terms of their languages. So Sanskrit is part of the Indo-European language family. Dravidian languages in the South are a very distinct hierarchy. So you kind of have, and people have forgotten about Aryans as colonizers, right? So one of his brilliant moves was to say that there were multiple colonialities in India, that the British were just kind of the latest iteration. Before that, you had the Mughals, and before that, but the first ones for them were the Brahmins. So today, when in India, again, we have, right-wing politics of Hindutva politics, or what we call Brahminic dominance. They think about the Brahmins as the true Hindus, but in fact, what Jyotiba Phule were doing was actually to talk about Brahmins as the first colonizers in India. And so then they began to say, okay, if we think about decoloniality, it can't be just against the British. It has to be also against the early settler colonizers. And how do we deal with, because these early settler colonizers, unlike in the Americas where they've been around for 500 years, in India, they had been by that point for almost 2,000 years, right? So after 2,000 years, then who's a settler and who's a native? These are kind of questions that become really important to answer. And so for them, kind of defining multiple colonialisms and then talking about caste, class, and gender as part of that kind of intersectional coloniality is what I kind of call their work. as intersectional coloniality. It was not enough for them to just define that. So if you can go to the next slide, please. They also began to then critique and enact decoloniality. And they did this by kind of 4 practices that I'm going to talk about. One is speaking truth to power. And the way they did that was by reinterpreting Indian history that was pre-British colonization. Because, there's a certain way in which you talk about ancient, medieval, and, and contemporary or modern history, but that always kind of centers Europeans and never centers local people. So they began to reinterpret history. They also practiced desegregation, as I said. They invented social rituals that were very critical of the Brahminic rituals, particularly around marriage and education, and also inheritance practices. And their focus was primarily on liberation through education and collective action. And so I'm going to kind of give you some examples of the ways in which they were doing that. And particularly what was important is most of the members of this society were either Dalits, lower caste, but because they also wanted to make it liberation for all, they also invited Brahmins, they also invited Muslims. So the society was committed to liberation for all, and that meant that it really brought in everybody. And that was sort of very interesting and important in 19th century colonial India, when even the British would not actually meet with, the locals, much less the locals meeting with each other. So their practices were really radical in terms of actually practicing decoloniality. Next slide, please. So one of the first ways in which they did that, as I said, is by revisioning and reimagining the place of Shudras. So Shudras are the lowest caste in the caste hierarchy. So you have the Brahmins at the top, then you have the Kshatriyas, who are the warriors, the Vaishyas, who are the traders, and then Shudras, who are primarily peasants, and they were at the bottom, right? And the word in Shudra in the Brahminic, literature is kind of the bottom, right? So Savitri Bai kind of wrote this poem, and most of the work that I've been doing on her is really through her writings, primarily poetry. She's written essays, poems. And so this was one of her poems in which she kind of imagines what a Shudra is, not the way that the Brahmins imagined them to be peasants at the bottom, but she says the word Shudra in truth connoted a native. So she's kind of talking about them as being the true natives. But the powerful victors, namely the Brahmins, made Shudras an invective. But such heroic people were our ancestors, and the descendants of such people are we, right? So she's kind of, really in some ways turning upside down the hierarchy of how the Brahmins renamed them Shudras at the bottom. But in fact, she talks about us as the natives and we are the heroic people because of the work we've been doing. Next slide, please. And Muktabai was an amazing teenager. There's only this one extant essay that I've been able to find to date. She was Dalit. She was not a Shudra, but she began to, again, following Savitri Bai's, kind of, in a way, invitation to reimagine Shudra history, talks about an alternative understanding of, the ways in which you can reclaim Shudras and who they were. So she says, these people drove us, and by these people, she means the Aryans, the Brahmins, right? The poor Mans and Mahars, so these were the names of the particular caste that are Shudras and Dalits, away from our own lands, which they occupied to build large buildings. And that was not all. They would make the Mans and Mahars drink oil mixed with red lead and buried our people in the foundations of their buildings, thus wiping out generation after generation of our people. Equally important is that by reinventing this, the Brahmins, in their kind of analysis, the Shudras were at the bottom because of the sins that they had committed in the previous lives, right? So their analysis that you can find in all of, the Brahminic literature is that the caste hierarchy reflects what you and your ancestors have done in previous life. So Muktabai, this teenager, she was 14 years old when she wrote this, by reclaiming that we were the people who worked the land, we were the people who were actually driven out, is in a way providing an alternative understanding of why the Shudras are Shudras. So kind of also critiquing the Brahminic notion of, previous life and the sins that you had committed, right? But what was also equally important is she did not let, because as you can just see from these two names that I'm talking about, Mangs and Mahars, the Indian caste system is so complex and there are so many different castes, even among the Shudras, even at the bottom, even among the Dalits, there are multiple. And so what she picked up, which is very interesting, and I think one of the first women to do that, was to talk about the power dynamics among the lower caste, right? Because as we all know, communities are not homogeneous. Communities have power dynamics, even the ones who are most oppressed. So she says, but the Mahars here no less untouchable than the monks, so both of these are untouchable communities, also avoid the company of monks. They have acquired some Brahminical traits and consider themselves to be superior to the monks. They also get polluted by the shadow of the monks, right? So these are two untouchable groups, but you get a little education, you get a little land, and then you kind of take on, which, a later sociologist in, the mid to late 20th century talks about this as the Sanskritization process, that each caste, to demonstrate that they have moved up in the caste mobility, take on Brahminic traits and Brahminic rituals, because those are all Sanskrit based, to kind of demonstrate that they have moved up, right? So she's kind of critiquing untouchables who do that as well. So in some ways, she was kind of foreshadowing by almost 40, 50 years. Ambedkar, if you don't know, Ambedkar, I really recommend. He was, in fact, the writer of the Indian Constitution, himself, again, a Dalit, but actually got a law degree at Columbia. And so, was able to, again, use what I'm going to talk about next, the ways in which coloniality helped certain Dalits get access to education and then make a critique, not just of coloniality, but also of earlier colonialities, namely the Brahmins, right? And so Ambedkar later called this what he called graded inequality, right? That even among the Dalits and even among the untouchables, there are still people you can kind of, who are below you, right? So this notion of caste hierarchy, which for almost 2 millennia in India had created hierarchies and created hierarchies within hierarchies, which Babasaheb Ambedkar then called graded inequality. So Muktabai, this 14-year-old teenager, in 19th century, she wrote this in 1878, was already figuring what Ambedkar would write in the 1940s about graded inequality and the distinctions among castes. Next slide, please. In addition to talking about the Dalits and the ways in kind of reinventing and reimagining their place in Indian society, the focus was also on gender. So caste and gender were very much part of the ways in which they were both critiquing coloniality and enacting decoloniality. So this Tripurush Tulna, comparing male and female. Now, Tarabai Shinde, who wrote this book again, was written in about 1882. She was not a Dalit because, as I mentioned, the Satyashodak Society, one of the main ways in which they enacted decoloniality was to be, an organization that brought different castes and different religions together. And she wrote the scathing critique of Brahminic patriarchy, right? Because Brahminic patriarchy then kind of, goes down the caste hierarchies to the Dalits. And what she did was she systematically addressed, both the literary and the popular discourse, kind of, great ethnography of the time, about women and their power. Women very often in 19th century, any powerful woman, and it's, true here, were seen to be witches. We all know about the Salem witch trials, in Massachusetts, but also in Europe before then. So they were, seen, their power was seen to be like black magic, which is interesting because in Brahminic Hinduism, there's also a way in which women power itself is feminine. So you have Durga and Kali, if you know the goddesses who also embody power, but then their power needs to be controlled by Shiva, who's kind of the male. So the male needs to kind of tame the power of this very powerful entity or goddess in the Brahminic hierarchy, right? So she talks about, the mean-spiritedness, the shallowness, and the ways in which women are treated. And she also characterizes, particularly importantly, the suffering of child widows, right? So in India at the time, marriages were arranged for children. And if, the husbands were usually much older, and if they died, a child would be widowed at the age of 5, 6, or 7, and then they couldn't remarry, right? But at the same time, they had to go to their in-laws' house, and very often they were the victims of rape by their brother-in-laws, father-in-laws. And so the Satyashodak Samaj became a home. And in fact, Savitribai and her husband adopted the children of the rape of a child widow, as a way to kind of say that it doesn't matter. I mean, she was raped. She had no, alternative. And so they kind of, also worked on the ways in which Brahminical patriarchy was so difficult for child widows in particular. Now, Tarabai, for writing this, and she was encouraged by the Satyashodak Samaj to do this, was heavily critiqued and marginalized, and in some ways kind of, pushed aside from her society. She had to leave her home and family and was taken up, by the organization. So the organization then also became a place to essentially provide refuge. In fact, one could think about them as the first kind of shelters, for women, who were abused and leave, not supported by their families. Next slide, please. One of the other things they also did is provided the ways in which Dalits should no longer feel that they had to follow any of the Brahminic understanding of who they were. So she said, so the Vedas are the scriptures that Brahmins used and recite as a way to kind of talk about purity and pollution, why the caste system exists, why the Dalits need to do this, why the Brahmins need to do that, right? And so this was again from Savitribai's, if the Vedas are for the Brahmins only, then we are not bound to act according to the Vedas. If merely looking at the Vedas can get us into grievous sin, that would not following them be the height of foolishness? So she says, why should we follow, all of the caste dictums of the Brahmins? If they think it's untouchable, let them think of, let that religion where only one person is privileged and the rest deprived vanish from the earth, and let it never enter our minds to boast of such a discriminatory religion. So Fule at the time actually came up with a sort of a universal religion of truth, and that's why, the society is called the Truth Seekers Society. And so he actually created, a whole new religion. He desegregated spaces. He actually invented new rituals, social rituals, particularly the marriage ritual, because in the marriage ritual, among the Brahmins and the upper caste, the woman is always subordinate to the man. You have to kind of obey him for the rest of your life. And if he dies, then you have to obey your son. So there's always kind of this way in which women have to follow male lead. And in this new marriage system, both of them were seen as equal. They both promised to kind of not only love and respect each other, but most importantly, the ritual also emphasizes the importance of working to liberate everyone, right? So it was also a form of kind of political commitment, to their solidarity. And so this ritual, which she invented, back in the 19th century, is still kind of active in India among those who are supporters. And both of them were from Maharashtra, and that's where the strongest followers of the Fule still are. And, what's interesting is that in her time and later on, she has been recognized, but most of the time, the Fules are recognized as activists, not necessarily as theorists or as providers of a new interpretation and understanding of, the roles of the marginalized communities, the peasants, the landless. And so for me, the important part of bringing their work to focus is also to kind of reinterpret them as truly being theorists who were ahead of their times in providing a revisionist history of what Indian colonization was about. Next slide, please. And one of the most important things that they did in enacting decoloniality is that they started schools. They started a lot of schools for girls and women, which was unheard of at the time, because even Brahmin women didn't go to schools at the time. So for Dalit and the marginalized caste to be actually able to go to school was in itself big. I mean, they almost opened something like 8 to 10 schools around Pune. Pune is a city in Maharashtra today, still a very big and important city, which was controlled by Peshwas, these rulers at the time. And so they opened, and what was interesting about their school is there were beginning to be a few schools in Calcutta, which is where the British colonial headquarters were, so to speak, for upper caste women, but they were supposed to be trained to be good wives and mothers. The schools that the Fule started had a social curriculum as well as a scientific curriculum. They taught math and physics. And most importantly, they focused on writing and individual expression, which is why, Muktabai, the 14-year-old, went to their school and was able to write this amazing critique. They also focused on group discussion. Group discussions became a way for students to learn from each other, to use their lived experiences to challenge the injustices of the Peshwas, this ruling class, of the Brahmins, and also the British, right? So you kind of have the group discussions and writing and expressions as ways to challenge the coloniality of the Brahmins and the coloniality of the British. But interestingly, they used English as a way to do that. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sure I don't have that slide in here. But what was interesting is they talk about why English is really important to use, that while for them, what difference does it make if it's the language of one colonizer or the other colonizer? They've been using colonizers' languages anyway, but English for the first time allows them to think and write freely and to imagine other free possibilities. And so, their use of English even at the time was very criticized by nationalist leaders who all were elite, who all themselves went to study in England and, to Cambridge, but yet they sort of saw their focus on English as somehow using, the colonial language. But in a way, kind of, it makes us rethink, Audre Lorde's famous essay on using the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. Maybe sometimes the master's tools can enable you to critique the master's house and maybe imagine different possibilities, right? And so I'm going to conclude quickly so that we have enough time for Q&A. And so I think the work of Foulé's represent a radical sociological praxis that provides insights into contemporary debates on decolonizing and globalizing sociology, right? They were members of, Foulé and members of the Samaj reinterpreted Brahminic rule as settler coloniality. They also used English as a strategic means to rewrite history, not just upward mobility, as is the case today, unfortunately, in post-colonial India. And despite their focus on Brahminic and British oppression, their organization was open even to Brahmins who shared their vision, right? And in some ways, it kind of, is an inclusive politics of solidarity and reminds me of works by Sylvia Wynter, who talks about the man as not somebody who's anatomically male, but somebody who embodies, that worldview. And so similarly for them, kind of working against Brahminic oppression kind of was not about Brahmins who, supported in some ways, liberation of those who were not Brahmins. And finally, I think their focus on truth is particularly relevant today in our post-truth world of alternative truths. So I will stop here and happy to take questions, comments.
Thank you, Manisha, for this fascinating lecture. And I'm sure it triggered many, many questions. It was very enriching and very interesting arguments you had. Yeah, I mean, the time management is great. Then we have really good time for the discussion and for questions. I see hands, but before that, I have to stop then the recording. Then we can start discussion.